going to now introduce two of our scientific committee for this symposium. First off, we have Dr Amy Hahs, who is a senior lecturer in urban horticulture at the University of Melbourne, is an urban ecologist who investigates how urban landscapes impact local ecology. She works on a diverse range of projects to develop green, healthy cities and conserve resilient ecosystems where we live and work. And Amy, you're here to talk about myth number 2, anything green will do. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Cathy. I've already jumped ahead through my first slides. I'm not sure if we can go back. So yeah, thank you for the invitation to speak today on this myth. I'll get the right button. I think I've got the pattern now. So for this myth, the idea is that anything green will do. If you stick some plants in, you've done the job. But like many good myths, when I was preparing this talk, I started to wonder, what's the origin of this myth? So I'm going to kind of go through a bit of a, play a bit of a wicked role and propose a few potential planks within the origin story for this myth, and then look to see, is there evidence to support that? Is that the full extent of the story? So as I was thinking about it, there were kind of 4 things that jumped out to me. The first one was this idea of grey versus green. So if you have vegetation compared to something that doesn't have vegetation, are you going to get a better biodiversity? Probably. The other one is the use of normalised difference vegetation index, or NDVI. So this is a really widespread resource. You can calculate it at very broad scales over very long time periods. The first Landsat missions were flown back in the 80s. So NDVI was a way to actually start to look at broader patterns of how much green and how did things respond. The next one, to be playing my wicked role, is the idea of novel ecosystems. So the idea that cities are very heterogeneous, there's a lot of change has happened within them, and we should actually embrace that. We don't need to try and return to some previous state. And then the other one is ecosystem services. So often when we are looking at cities, some of the ecosystem services that were addressed very early on were related to things like urban heat island, where green is important. But I'm going to spend most of my talk just looking at some of the recent research around each of these 4 topics, and then start to evaluate where we are in terms of this as a myth. In doing so, I want to acknowledge that knowledge evolves over time. So science is no different from many other knowledge systems. You start off with kind of some simple observations, and then as your experience with those observations grows, you become increasingly more complicated and more complex in your understandings. The other part of this myth that I thought I would throw out there is perhaps as scientists, maybe we haven't got our messaging right. Should we actually take a pause and look at what is the messaging we're sending out there? Is it time to reframe it? Much like Neil mentioned in the previous panel session. So to start with the first origin story plank, green versus grey. So this is a very simple way of looking at, is there something worth investigating here? So you take, for example, a sidewalk that's paved, and then you modify it and bring some green, add some plants, and then monitor the biodiversity response. So in this example, I'm using the experiment to design and test a plant palette for streetscapes. What we see in terms of the data is 4 different sites where this was conducted. At each site, there was an impact location where the change was made, but also a nearby control site. And the surveys were conducted both before and after the modification. And what you want to see in order to say, yes, it is having an impact, is more higher blue bars in all the impact sites and relatively even bars in all the control sites. And so looking at this output for bee species richness, you would say, yes, adding green is good for biodiversity. However, if you look at how each of the different sites is responding, there's obviously still a lot of variability in the data sets. And so that opens an opportunity for new questions about why are some sites like Clowes Street responding really well, whereas others like Docklands Drive aren't responding to quite the same extent. So in terms of myths about green versus grey, this is just one example, but a lot of the researchers out there would support this. Yes, green is good, but the type of green matters. Moving on to the next origin story related to NDVI. So again, just pulling out an example of research that's been conducted recently, but is reflective of a much broader body of research that's been done over the past 20 years. In this case, it's looking at the diversity metrics related to bird diversity in urban areas against a gradient of greenness using NDVI. So we have NDVI along the x-axis moving from very ungreen or grey right through to very green parts of the landscape. And you can see in all cases there's a positive relationship, well, all except one, a positive relationship. If you have more green, you have more biodiversity. That's the initial message, but then when you look at all the individual points, there's a lot of scatter around those lines. So that opens the opportunity to actually stop and ask the next question: why are some sites really responding positively and others not so much? So in this case, the researchers went and actually looked at individual bird species and how are they responding to NDVI. And you can see from the curves that across these 16 different species, they're all showing their own unique response to how much green is in the landscape. And it's going to be a reflection not just of how green is it, but what is present within that green. Is it meeting the needs of that species in terms of food resources, nesting habitats, competition, things like that. So again, the message from the work that's coming out is, yes, green is good, but the type of green matters. The next myth is the origin story related to novel ecosystems. And so this is the idea that if you have a big diversity of plants present in your landscape, you can support a broader diversity of other species. In this case, in a study looking at pollinators and the response of pollinators and plant flowering across an urban area, and comparing native plants to exotic plants over a year-long period, you can see in the top corner, we have across the entire year, which is the x-axis on all of these, flowering density, which is the top left corner. Native plants peak in their flowering in the first half of the year, and then they tail off, while exotic plants actually pick up flowering during that period. So they're providing an additional resource during a period when native plants are less abundant. So the message from this is that, yes, introduced plants have a role to play in our urban ecosystems and supporting biodiversity present within them. But that role is going to change over the course of the year. So yeah, again, green is good, but the type of green matters. There's a lot to novel ecosystems. So thinking about the availability of flowering plants and flowers, how does that actually translate to what pollinators are visiting them? So this is results from Monique Byrne's honours project last year, where she was comparing wild bee communities in areas that were planted with native plants and similar areas planted with exotic plant species. And all of the bee species are the black bars on the right-hand side, and all of the plants that they were recorded interacting with are the coloured bars on the left side. The exotic plants are at the top in the blue, the indigenous plants are in the middle in the yellow, and the native plants are at the bottom in the green. And you can see there are a lot of native bees using exotic plants, but actually there's a much heavier or more abundant interactions between native bees and indigenous plants. And if you think about the context of Australia, highly isolated for a very long time, a very long history of coevolution, it would make sense that there will be stronger affinities between, or stronger interactions between some bee species and certain plant species. So again, all of those plants are playing a role supporting the bee pollinator community, but particular plants are playing different roles, so the type of green matters. If we look not just at bees, but is this pattern present in other species or taxa groups? This study by Lewis Marta et al. Looking at insect biodiversity responses to native, introduced or indigenous plant species, but also controlling for the functional form of the plants. All of the blue bars are the indigenous plant species. So regardless of whether you're looking at trees or mid-story, or you're looking at the different types of plants, whether they're a forb or a flowering plant or a grass, all the indigenous plants are correlated with much higher diversity of all the different insect taxa. And just to make the point that this isn't just in Australia, Katie Burton and Freya and Sarah Beckersey did a review of papers looking at these relationships and the importance of native plant species on the diversity of different taxa. And the white bars present within the columns, all of those are native plants, and you can see that they're dominant. So again, the same message is coming through. If we briefly look now at ecosystem services, ecosystem services is a huge topic. I'm not even going to try and cover all of it, but in relating it to the origin story of this green is anything green will do myth, one of the Potential origins of this is those early studies looking at the effect of vegetation on urban heat island and the cooling effect it can have. And so here's an example of a paper, another recent paper looking at multiple cities across Europe on the x-axis, and the difference in temperature between an urban fabric with trees compared to an urban fabric without trees. And then the three different colours represent seasons, with the hottest observations being the dot points. And the line up near the top at 0, that would be no difference. And you can see that there's only a couple of instances where there's very little difference. And for all of the other cities, having trees present in the urban fabric definitely decreases the temperature. So again, green is good, but the type of green matters. And if we think beyond just a single type of ecosystem service, but all the different range of services that we're asking our urban green spaces to provide, and all the different types of green spaces that we need to have present in our cities, from recreation reserves through to botanic gardens, community gardens, residential gardens, streetscapes. A review looking at the relationship between urban green space type and the type of ecosystem service that has been recorded within it. There's definite trends. So some, like parks and gardens, have multiple ecosystem services that they're delivering, whereas others, such as nature parks, it's a much more limited suite. So really thinking about every green space is not delivering the same exact ecosystem service across our cities. Green is good, but the type of green matters. So coming back again to those 4 different domains, it's coming through very clearly. Green is good, but the type of green matters. It matters because having green only gets you part way in terms of species diversity. It ignores the effectiveness of different types of green and the structures present within them. You have to apply it with caution, as we saw with the novel ecosystems and role of exotic plants. It's not always going to deliver the same exact service. And also, we can't ignore this huge broader range of services that we're asking our cities to provide. So it's time to change the message. But what do we change it to? First of all, we need to recognise that not all greens are equal. So if I was going to a 70s party, I might wear this shade of green. But if I want to go somewhere else, or I want to redo my kitchen, I might choose something else. So within our urban landscapes, there's all sorts of hues of green, and we need to be recognising that and not treating them equally. So the first part of that is disentangling the relationship between biodiversity or the motivations for greening. So our motivations are to preserve Australia's unique plants and animals and ecosystems for the multiple benefits they provide to humans. And so the first part is conservation. The second part is ecosystem services. They're related, but they're not a one-to-one perfect relationship. If you think about it into different scales, you can have a biodiversity outcome or an ecosystem service outcome. If we ignore both of these, we're going to lose out on both. If we focus too much on ecosystem services, people win, but biodiversity misses out. Think about plane trees for shade. If we just think about biodiversity, nature wins, but people miss out. So the example I use for this is Greswold Forest near Bundoora. It's a beautiful remnant patch of vegetation surrounded by a very high chain link fence with barbed wire at the top. If I didn't know that that was somewhere I wanted to enter, I would avoid going into that place. Where we need to get to is where biodiversity and ecosystems both win. The other important step is to better understand these nuances present between the hues. And for this, there's some really important work emerging in the US, led by Christopher Schell and colleagues, looking at the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments. And they're relating legacies of planning policies, and particularly the redlining policy, on the distribution of urban forms and who lives within them, and recognising that how green space is distributed across those is really also going to impact what type of diversity is present and that people can experience. So, translating research to practice, taking our knowledge and working out how do we share that with practitioners. And what's the new message? With apologies to Dr. Seuss, anything green will do. Will it do? No. Choose your hue for it to do what you want it to. Thanks.